The light switch made the exact same soft click it had made 20 years ago when I first stepped into that office. Back then, it was a dusty corner in a converted warehouse with flickering overhead bulbs, a squeaky folding chair, and a white board that still contained someone else's dried marker doodles. Now it was a glass-walled corner suite with custom walnut desks, ergonomic leather seating, and a sleek brass nameplate that read Senior Enterprise Software Architect for approximately 12 more seconds. I stood at the doorway with my hand resting on the plastic switch, watching the cool white fluorescent panels blink off for the very last time. Behind me, my office ficus plant drooped slightly in its ceramic pot, almost as if it had sensed the heavy mood in the room. A framed photograph of myself alongside the original co-founders still rested on the top shelf of the oak bookcase, leaning slightly sideways ever since the night cleaning crew had bumped it a month ago. I had never bothered to straighten it. Perhaps deep down I had known this day was coming. The wide carpeted corridor outside was humming with the dull, collective murmur of employees pretending to be deeply immersed in their spreadsheets. When you have been with a tech company for as long as I have, your name stops being just a title on an organizational chart. It becomes a persistent whisper that middle managers squint at during quarterly budget reviews, and fresh computer science interns attempt to search on LinkedIn. Yet, despite 20 years of sweat equity, you can be erased in a single afternoon with a single sentence. One smug, heavily rehearsed, corporate sanitized human resources line. The exit is directly behind you, Grant, Chief Executive Officer Preston Thorne had said moments earlier, grinning like a man who genuinely believed he had just pulled off a masterclass in executive leadership. We will get back to Preston Thorne in just a moment. But before we dive into his costly mistake, if you are listening to this story right now, please take a quick second to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. It really helps our team bring you more stories of corporate hubris, workplace karma, and patient, legal revenge. Leaving a technology platform you practically birthed from a clean text file is a peculiar feeling. When I first joined as the lead engineer, the entire codebase was held together by virtual duct tape and sheer willpower. Two original co-founders operated out of a cramped two-bedroom apartment that perpetually smelled of burned dark roast coffee and stale microwave burritos. The primary staging server was literally a noisy tower unit sitting on a piece of cardboard under someone's bed. I wrote the very first line of what would eventually become a $500 million enterprise software suite on a borrowed laptop while a stray tiger-striped cat walked across the keyboard. I did not merely build the system. For 2 decades, I was the system. I designed the initial authentication handshakes, engineered the high-throughput reporting pipeline, and hand-coded the core database routing protocols that we eventually wrapped in a modern web framework. While other department heads went out for 3-hour expense account lunches, I stayed at my workstation writing patches, refining security measures, and onboarding every incoming chief technology officer who strutted through the doors believing he was the second coming of Silicon Valley greatness. Not a single one of them was. Over 20 years, 3 different executive teams came and went. Some were capable, some were remarkably clueless, but none of them ever questioned my standing. I was not flashy. I did not give loud speeches at company-wide all-hands meetings. But when the primary server cluster glitched at 2 in the morning on Christmas Eve, or when an enterprise encryption certificate approached its expiration date, guess whose phone rang? The ghost in the digital machine, Grant Vance. I navigated the company through regulatory audits, aggressive acquisition attempts, internal restructuring, and dozens of high-stakes product launches. And through every crisis, quietly and methodically, I resolved the issues. I kept the underlying engine humming while executives played corporate dress-up in their corner suites. And then Preston Thorne arrived. Preston was the exact archetype of a modern private equity hire. He spoke in a rapid-fire sequence of corporate buzzwords, insisted on using terms like paradigm shift and hyperscaling in every conversation, and wore cologne that smelled like desperate ambition. The venture capital board had brought him in to streamline operations, which in reality meant cutting any budget line item that was not shiny new or immediately marketable to external buyers. To Preston, A 54-year-old architect who cared about code stability rather than flashy slide decks was nothing more than expensive legacy baggage. He strutted into his first quarterly meeting with laminated charts and slide presentations full of promises about cloud-native revolutions. I asked him once during a technical review how he planned to handle database sharding across our distributed nodes. He blinked, adjusted his designer tie, and replied that he preferred not to get bogged down in the low-level weeds. That was executive speak for the fact that he had skimmed a blog post on the airplane and understood none of it. I did not argue. I nodded politely, maintained the infrastructure, and kept the platform running seamlessly. Until this morning. At exactly 9:30, Preston summoned me to his top-floor office. Two human resources representatives, Brenda Lawson and Donald Mercer, sat stiffly on a leather couch like silent guards. Preston delivered the termination decision with the casual apathy of a valet handing back a parking ticket. "Grant," he said, resting his elbows on his mahogany desk, "we are restructuring the technology division. The board agrees it is time for fresh blood and modern technical leadership. You have had a remarkably good run, but your role is being rendered redundant." I sat motionless. I did not flinch, nor did I raise my voice. I simply looked him dead in the eye and remained silent. "Is there anything you would like to ask or say regarding the transition, Brenda?" Lawson asked, her eyes darting nervously between my placid expression and her open laptop screen. I considered pointing out the sheer absurdity of their timing. I considered mentioning that firing the only person who understood the proprietary architecture might not be the most prudent business decision. Instead, I simply stood up, smoothed down the front of my jacket, gathered my personal notebook, and said no. I walked down the long carpeted hallway past junior developers who suddenly found their monitors fascinating. I reached my office, gathered my mug, packed my notebook into my briefcase, and flipped off the light switch. Click. One tiny sound to mark the conclusion of 20 years. Except it was not the end at all. It was merely the opening move. The corporate severance package they handed me on the way out was a textbook exercise in corporate condescension. Donald Mercer, the company's senior legal counsel, had slid a thick blue folder across the desk containing 2 months of base salary, standard health insurance continuation under COBRA, and outplacement assistance services. They had even included a mandatory non-disparagement agreement, assuming that 60 days of pay would be more than enough to buy the silence of a 54-year-old engineer. What Donald Mercer and Preston Thorne completely failed to realize was that under Title 29, United States Code, Section 2101, commonly known as the Warren Act, mass restructuring and executive terminations within major enterprise entities require strict 60-day advance written notice when specific operational thresholds are met. But more importantly, they had conducted zero legal due diligence regarding the underlying intellectual property rights governing the entire software enterprise. I walked down the 5 flights of stairs instead of taking the glass elevator. I had no desire to stand shoulder to shoulder with mid-level managers who would stare at the floor and pretend they did not know what had just transpired. Outside, a chilly October rain was falling over the concrete parking structure. I placed my briefcase on the passenger seat of my sedan, shut the door, and turned off my cellular phone mid-vibration. My personal phone had already begun buzzing with automated notifications, Slack alerts, and calendar reminders. I slid the device into the glove compartment, turned the ignition key, and pulled out of the corporate park. I did not drive straight home to my suburban house. Instead, I drove east toward the older side of town, passing the sterile commercial strips and chain restaurants until I reached a quiet brick building tucked behind the county library. It was a small, independent coffee shop with mismatched wooden tables, worn leather armchairs, and an espresso machine that hummed with a comforting rhythm. I had not stepped foot inside the place in nearly 15 years. "Grant?" the barista said, looking up from the counter in genuine surprise. "It has been a lifetime. Are you still working those 100-hour coding weeks over at the tech park?" "Not anymore, Mary," I said with a slight smile. "Just a warm drip coffee and one of those dark molasses cookies, please." I carried my tray to a corner table near the back window where the rain streaked down the glass. From my briefcase, I pulled out a worn red leather binder. The corners of the leather were rubbed raw from years of storage in my home fireproof safe, and the brass rings inside clicked open with a heavy, satisfying thud. Inside that binder lived the complete, unvarnished history of the software platform that Preston Thorne believed his company owned back in 2006, when the company was nothing more than four guys sharing a rented room and a broken coffee maker. We had no funding. The initial venture capital check had not cleared, and the original co-founder, Julian Holloway, could not afford to pay me a standard engineering salary. To keep the project alive, I agreed to write the full foundational architecture on one binding condition. We drafted a formal intellectual property agreement. Under Title 17, United States Code, Section 1706, the exclusive rights to reproduce, prepare, derivative works, distribute copies, and license computer software remain strictly with the original author unless a formal written assignment of copyright is executed and recorded. To protect my work while the company established its corporate entity, I incorporated an independent development firm named Sentinel Loop Technologies, LLC. The initial agreement explicitly specified that ownership of the core source code, proprietary algorithms, database schemas, and compiled executable libraries would remain the sole property of Sentinel Loop Technologies, LLC, until a complete corporate buyout and formal copyright assignment deed was executed in writing. Over the next 20 years, the company grew from a scrappy startup into an enterprise giant valued at $500 million. But amidst the chaos of rapid growth, corporate acquisitions, and changing executive leadership, that formal transfer of ownership was never completed. I flipped to the second tab of the red leather binder. Inside were printed copies of email chains stretching back over a decade. In July of 2008, I had sent a written memo to co-founder Julian Holloway reminding him that we needed to execute the final intellectual property assignment for Sentinel Loop Technologies. Julian had replied, "Thanks, Grant. Let us loop in legal as soon as we finish this funding round." In March of 2012, during a major server upgrade, I had flagged the issue again. The new chief operating officer had responded, "Appreciate the heads up, but we are fully focused on the quarterly revenue targets right now. We will handle the paperwork later." And most importantly, 18 months ago, when Preston Thorne was brought in by the private equity board, I had sent him a comprehensive infrastructure audit document via registered email. The document explicitly stated that the core authentication framework and proprietary data routing algorithms were still held under license from Sentinel Loop Technologies, LLC, and required formal legal reconciliation. Preston Thorne's written response was recorded right there on page 42 of my binder. "Thanks, Grant. Not a priority at this time. Let us stay laser-focused on monetization and forward velocity. We will circle back after the fourth quarter." They had never circled back. To Preston and the board, I was just an obedient employee who would always be there to keep the servers running. They assumed that because the software operated on their cloud servers, they automatically owned every line of code inside it. They had confused physical possession with legal ownership. I opened my personal laptop, connected to my secure mobile hotspot, and composed a quick email to attorney Howard Ross at Ross & Associates, one of the top intellectual property litigators in the state. "Howard," I wrote, attaching high-resolution scans of every document in the red leather binder. "The executive team terminated my employment this morning without notice or cause. As of 10 o'clock today, Sentinel Loop Technologies, LLC is revoking all implicit operating licenses for the core software suite. Please review the attached deeds and stand by for my instruction." I closed the laptop, took a slow sip of my coffee, and enjoyed the quiet atmosphere of the coffee shop. Across town at corporate headquarters, the clock was ticking. At precisely 10:17 in the morning, the first silent fracture appeared in the company's digital empire. 300 miles away in Richmond, Virginia, the IT director for East Coast Healthcare Systems was attempting to process a batch of 25,000 patient compliance records through our enterprise portal. The screen flickered, loaded for several seconds, and then threw a fatal system exception error. Authentication module X032 not responding. Access denied by core engine. 5 minutes later, a major claims processing firm in Ohio, experienced a total blackout of their administrative dashboard. By 10:30, a primary defense logistics contractor in Washington, D.C. left an urgent voicemail for the corporate client success team, demanding to know why their real-time tracking suite was refusing master administrative credentials. Corporate enterprise software does not fail with a loud explosion. It breaks quietly, module by module, until the entire infrastructure collapses under the weight of its own unresolved dependencies. Inside the glass-walled headquarters, the internal alert monitors in the DevOps department began flashing yellow, then orange, and finally deep crimson. Sarah Jenkins, the lead DevOps engineer, stared at her triple-monitor workstation in growing disbelief. The primary server clusters were not crashing due to high traffic or hardware failure. The processor usage was normal. The network bandwidth was clear, and the cloud servers were fully operational. Yet, every incoming client request was being systematically rejected at the foundational security layer. The core routing algorithms, the proprietary software modules I had authored 20 years ago, had reached their scheduled cryptographic key rotation window. For 20 years, I had manually executed the security handshake update on the final Tuesday of every quarter. It was an intricate, highly specialized procedure that required administrative authority originating from the registered master key of Sentinel Loop Technologies, LLC. Because management had considered the underlying security architecture legacy code, no one else in the building even knew the rotation schedule existed. When HR revoked my internal company credentials at 9:45, the automated security subsystem detected an unauthorized administrative change at the parent entity level. Acting exactly as I had programmed it to do 2 decades ago, the core engine locked down all active API bridges, isolated the master databases, and entered read-only protection mode. By 11:02 in the morning, Chief Executive Officer Preston Thorne was standing inside the climate-controlled server room, his face flushed red and his expensive silk tie hanging loose around his collar. "What do you mean the system is refusing credentials?" Preston shouted, his voice echoing over the loud hum of the cooling fans. "Just issue a hard reboot. Clear the cache and restart the cloud containers." "We cannot simply reboot the containers, Mr. Thorne," Sarah Jenkins shouted back, her fingers flying across her keyboard as diagnostic scripts failed one after another. "The underlying authentication kernel is completely locked. The system is rejecting our administrative master key." "Then override it," Preston demanded, pounding his fist against the side of an equipment rack. "You are the engineering team. Hack into it if you must." "We cannot hack into our own foundational security layer," Sarah said, looking up with pale skin and wide eyes. "The encryption module is wrapped in a proprietary shell. The master authority server is refusing to recognize our company as an authorized licensee. It is returning a statutory copyright restriction code." By 11:45, the corporate call center was in absolute bedlam. Over 40 enterprise clients, accounting for more than 60% of the company's annual recurring revenue, were locked out of their operational systems. Sales representatives were ducking into break rooms to avoid incoming phone calls from furious vice presidents. In the executive suite, Donald Mercer was sitting at his computer, frantically searching through internal corporate registries for any document related to the core software architecture. His search turned up nothing. No recorded copyright assignments, no patent transfers, no executed IP bills of sale. When he finally dug into the legacy server archives from 2006, he found the original founding charter. Attached to the back of the PDF was a single scanned page stamped by a notary public. "Licensing rights and source code ownership shall remain exclusively with Sentinel Loop Technologies, LLC, registered to Grant Vance, until full corporate acquisition terms are satisfied in writing." Donald Mercer's hands began to shake. He picked up his desk phone and dialed Preston Thorne's direct extension. "Preston," Donald said, his voice cracking slightly. "You need to come to my office right now. We have a catastrophic legal problem." "What kind of problem?" Preston snapped over the line. "The software," Donald whispered, staring at the screen in absolute horror. "We do not own it. Grant Vance owns it." By 1:30 in the afternoon, the executive floor of corporate headquarters had descended into complete operational chaos. Julian Halloway, the original co-founder who had retired to a sprawling vineyard in Sonoma 5 years earlier while retaining a significant seat on the board, was on speakerphone in the main conference room. His voice was blaring through the high-end ceiling speakers at maximum volume, laced with unbridled fury. "What do you mean Grant owns the platform?" Julian roared, his voice cutting through the tense air of the room. "We spent 20 years building a $500 million enterprise. How in the hell did no one execute the copyright transfer deeds?" Preston Thorne sat at the head of the conference table, his pristine suit jacket discarded over the back of a chair, his forehead covered in a fine sheen of cold sweat. "Julian, calm down," Preston stammered, attempting to maintain his polished executive composure. "This is clearly a minor administrative misunderstanding. Grant was an employee. Anything he built during his tenure automatically falls under the work-for-hire doctrine. Our legal team will file an emergency injunction to compel him to surrender the security keys." "Work for hire," Donald Mercer interrupted, shaking his head bitterly as he tossed a stack of printed documents onto the center of the table. "Preston, I have spent the last 2 hours reviewing federal copyright case law under Title 17, United States Code, Section 106. The work-for-hire doctrine only applies if there is no explicit written agreement to the contrary executed prior to the creation of the work." Donald tapped his finger against the notarized 2006 agreement. "Grant explicitly signed an independent contractor agreement under Sentinel Loop Technologies LLC before he ever became a W-2 employee." Donald explained, his voice trembling. "He retained full personal copyright ownership of the core engine. Furthermore, we have recorded email evidence stretching over 15 years where Grant explicitly offered to transfer the IP in exchange for equity reconciliation, and management, including you, Preston, repeatedly declined to execute the documents." The speakerphone crackled as Julian Holloway let out a string of furious curses. "You fired Grant Vance?" Julian shouted. "You fired the man who holds the absolute legal master key to our entire tech stack without checking the IP registry first? He was legacy weight," Preston yelled back, finally snapping under the intense pressure. "He was making $300,000 a year and refusing to adopt our new cloud initiatives. He built the entire business." Julian screamed back. "You just handed a $500 million enterprise over to a man you threw out the door with a 2-month severance package. If our enterprise clients pull their contracts due to this outage, the board will hold you personally liable for breach of fiduciary duty and dissipation of corporate assets." Inside the war room, the internal system monitors updated again. Over 84% of enterprise transactions were now failing. The company's primary credit rating agency had just flagged the entity for potential operational default, and legal notices from 3 Fortune 500 clients had already hit Donald Mercer's inbox. At exactly 2:15, Donald looked at Preston with hollow eyes. "Call him," Donald said flatly. "Call whom?" Preston asked. Though he already knew the answer, "Call Grant," Donald replied. "Offer him whatever he wants, because if he does not re-enable the core security handshakes by 5 o'clock, this company will be bankrupt by Friday." At 2:30 in the afternoon, sitting quietly in my armchair at the coffee shop, I finally retrieved my personal phone from my briefcase and switched it back on. I needed to retrieve a secure 2-factor verification code to sign a document that attorney Howard Ross had prepared. The moment the cellular signal connected, the device went into an absolute frenzy. The screen lit up with a continuous cascade of alerts: 185 missed calls, 92 text messages, 47 voicemails, urgent emails from board members, senior engineers, and department heads. I ignored every single one of them. My phone began ringing immediately in my hand. The incoming caller identification showed Preston Thorne's direct mobile number. I watched the screen flash for several seconds, took a bite of my cookie, and let it go straight to voicemail. 10 seconds later, it rang again. This time it was Donald Mercer. I let it ring out. On the third attempt, a text message popped up from Julian Holloway. "Grant, please answer. I am flying back from California right now. We need to talk." I replied with a brief text message. "Hello, Julian. All communications regarding Sentinel Loop Technologies, LLC must be directed to my legal counsel, Howard Ross at Ross & Associates. Have a pleasant flight." I placed the phone face down on the table, leaned back in my chair, and watched the rain fall softly against the glass. By 4:30 that afternoon, the main conference room at Ross and Associates looked like a high-stakes corporate tribunal. Attorney Howard Ross Hall sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit. I sat directly to his right, wearing a comfortable sweater, sipping a fresh cup of black coffee, and holding my red leather binder resting closed in front of me. Across the table sat a thoroughly beaten executive team. Preston Thorne looked like he had not slept in 3 days. His hair was disheveled, his eyes were bloodshot, and his confidence had completely evaporated. Next to him sat Donald Mercer, surrounded by 3 outside litigation attorneys who had clearly told him on the drive over that they had zero legal leverage. Julian Halloway sat at the far end, having joined via video conference from his private jet's satellite connection. Gentleman Howard Ross began, his voice calm, deliberate, and entirely devoid of emotion. We have reviewed the current status of Sentinel Loop Technologies, LLC, and its proprietary software framework. As you are now fully aware, your organization has been operating under an implicit, revocable license for the past 20 years. That license was formally revoked as of 10 o'clock this morning. Preston Thorne cleared his throat, trying desperately to summon his old executive authority. Mr. Ross Grant, we are prepared to offer a very substantial resolution, Preston said, sliding a document across the table. We will reinstate Grant immediately with a full executive title, a 20% salary increase, and a generous signing bonus of $500,000, provided he immediately restores system access and signs the standard IP assignment agreement. Howard Ross did not even pick up the paper. He simply pushed it back across the smooth table with the tip of his pen. That proposal is entirely non-viable, Howard said coolly. Grant Vance is not seeking employment with your organization. He is the sole owner and licenser of the underlying technology. If you wish to continue utilizing the Sentinel Loop engine to service your clients, you will agree to our commercial licensing terms. Howard opened a thick folder and handed copy sets to Donald Mercer and the outside legal team. Here are our terms, Howard continued. First, Sentinel Loop Technologies LLC will grant a 3-year exclusive commercial operating license for the core architecture. The upfront licensing fee is $90 million. Payable within 24 hours, Donald Mercer gasped, dropping his pen onto the table. $90 million? Second, Howard continued without missing a beat, Sentinel Loop Technologies LLC will receive a 10% ongoing gross royalty on all enterprise subscriptions processed through the platform. Third, Grant Vance will retain absolute architectural oversight and board-level veto power over any proposed modifications to the core security framework. Preston Thorne stood up so fast, his chair screeched against the hardwood floor. "This is extortion," Preston yelled, pointing a finger across the table. "You are holding our entire enterprise hostage." "No, Mr. Thorne," I said, speaking for the very first time in the meeting. My voice was quiet, but it commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. "I am enforcing the legal rights I explicitly preserved 20 years ago." "You called me legacy code this morning, Preston. You told me it was time for fresh blood. You assumed that because I stayed quiet and did my job, I was weak. But an architect does not destroy his own creation. He simply retains the keys." Julian Halloway's face appeared on the large video screen. "Accepted the terms," Julian ordered sternly, staring directly at Donald Mercer. "Accept every single clause right now. There is one final clause," Howard Ross added, turning to page 8 of the agreement. "Clause 15 requires the immediate, uncompensated resignation of Preston Thorne from all executive and operational roles within the corporation, effective immediately upon signing. Furthermore, the company will issue a formal internal announcement clarifying that Grant Vance's departure was entirely an executive miscommunication, acknowledging his foundational role as the creator of the enterprise architecture." Preston turned pale. He looked at Donald Mercer, then at the video screen showing Julian Halloway. "Julian," Preston whispered, "you cannot let them do this." "You did this to yourself, Preston," Julian said coldly. "You sacrificed our entire technical foundation for your own short-sighted ego. Hand over your corporate badge to Donald and leave the room." 10 minutes later, the agreement was fully executed. Digital signatures were verified, wire transfers were initiated, and the formal legal notices were filed. At 5:15 in the afternoon, I pulled out my laptop, logged into the secure portal of Sentinel Loop Technologies LLC, and entered the master cryptographic override key. Across the city, the red alert monitors in the company's DevOps department instantly shifted back to green. System throughput returned to 100%. The East Coast Healthcare portal re-authenticated, government tracking, dashboards lit up, and millions of enterprise transactions began processing seamlessly once again. The $500 million software platform was fully operational. But from that moment on, every single byte of data that flowed through its pipes generated a royalty for Sentinel Loop Technologies LLC. The following morning, I walked back into corporate headquarters. Not as an employee, but as the chairman of the technology licensor. Employees stood along the hallway, watching silently as I walked past the CEO suite, where maintenance workers were already removing Preston Thorne's nameplate from the wall. I reached my old office, pushed open the door, and stepped inside. The office was quiet. The rain had cleared outside, leaving bright morning sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I walked over to the wall, placed my hand on the plastic light switch, and flicked it on. The overhead lights buzzed to life with a familiar, reassuring hum. I sat down at my desk, opened my notebook, and got back to work.